Here we are at the last night of our class. This is week 14, and tonight we'll have lectures 27 and 28. And like last week, I'm going to combine these two lectures together so that it's kind of one long lecture, but we'll have a break in the middle. Tonight we're going to talk about the Age of Discovery, and what we're going to do is tie everything together. We're going to connect the whole world together. And we've been talking about world civilizations, about a whole set of separate civilizations, and tonight they're all going to connect into a network where they all become part of one big network. And this is largely because of the activities of Europeans. We call it, it might be an anachronism to call it the Age of Discovery. It's only a discovery if you take it from the European perspective, that the Europeans are going out and discovering all these other cultures. We might call it the Age of European Discovery, because all the other peoples already knew they were there. What they didn't know was where the Europeans were. And the Europeans, in an amazingly short space of 100 years, they found everywhere else outside the world, except Australia and Antarctica, but they found everything else and connected everything together with a network of colonies and trading posts throughout the entire world. So this is what we're going to talk about tonight. And let's start by going back. Now we've got our title slide on here. Okay, lectures 27 and 28. Let's start by looking at Europe itself. Last time we talked about the 12th century Renaissance, and a Renaissance, of course, is a great rebirth, but we had many small rebirths before that. If you think about Europe and the lectures we've had on the early Germans and the year 1000, we had a whole series of small renaissances, one right after another, and now we have the large Renaissance of the 12th century. And this is part of the character of Europe, which is different. It kind of keeps reformulating itself, and the changes that took place in the 12th century Renaissance were extremely important to why these Europeans went out and connected the whole world together in just a short century. Let's kind of review what we talked about last time. We talked about the states of Europe. We talked about, well, first of all, here's France. The reaction of the French to the Viking invasions was a fragmentation and a new order of society, a new social and political order. But the French kingdom finally did unify under Philip Augustus, and you see here on this map, you see the green region around Paris in the middle of the process of unifying all of France. We see the formulation of proto-national states. With Germany, Italy should not be unified there, but Germany and Italy both were very fragmented as well. Germany was unified in short spaces of time. Under Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II, it was unified briefly, but then it disintegrated in the midst of quarrels with the popes. The papal interference in the German traditional government of elective monarchy, the papacy throwing its influence first on one side and then on the other, fomenting civil wars in Germany, contributed to the disintegration of Germany. So Germany did not found a proto-national state that would carry through into the early modern world. Germany was fragmented in a reverse process to France. England, on the other hand, was super unified, first of all with the Norman conquest, and then with 3/4 of France under the Angevin Empire. Here you see a map of the Anglo-Norman Empire under William the Conqueror and his sons. And then the Angevin Empire under Henry II and his sons pulled together 3/4 of France and all of England, and England was the most precocious of these political proto-states, if you want to call them proto-national states, with its centralized government and its bureaucracy and its primacy of the king and the king's courts in the rule of the land. And remember that one of the most important things about England was Magna Carta and the putting of the king under the law, the establishing of the concept that the king was under the law. And this was very important in the creation of England as one of these proto-national states, the first one and perhaps the model for the rest of Europe. We also saw some other developments in Europe in the 12th century. We saw a papal government building itself, modeling itself on the examples of France and England with their parliaments and with their king and his relationship with the barons. We see a very similar process taking place under the popes with his creation of the College of Cardinals. And those of you who saw the newspaper Sunday saw that the newest cardinal that we know of now in the Pope's Council in his College of Cardinals is a Texan. He is the Archbishop of the Houston-Galveston Diocese, and he is the newest cardinal who's just been crowned. Crowned is the wrong word. Designated, appointed. And so the College of Cardinals advises the Pope and helps him out and elects the popes in the same way or in a somewhat similar process to the way parliaments and the King's Court advises the feudal kings. And so we see the formation of the typical European style of government taking its shape in the 12th century Renaissance. We also saw a huge change in all of society, and I should have had a couple of more pictures here, but this is King Arthur and the Round Table, and what it represents here is the rise of a new mentality in Europe, a new way of thinking. And I told you last time there were new conceptions of Christ, Mary, and the devil, that Christ was seen as in his human guise, not in his spiritual or religious guise, but in his human form. And so the emphasis was on the humanity of Christ and how God loved human beings, and that human beings were made in the image of God, just like Christ was, which changed the way people thought. The image of Mary became quite different. In the image of Christ, we had the image of him as a stern judge who ruled the world and who rewarded and punished people. And then we have the switch to the portrayal of Christ on the crucifix in his human form. With Mary, the conception of Mary changes from its original conception of her as a kind of vessel who contained the Christ child. Now she becomes a loving mother and also a person who judges as God had judged before, but a person who judges with mercy. And so the introduction of the concept of mercy is identified with Mary. We also talked about a new conception of the devil, and whereas the devil was shown as realistic, as in the early Christian church when the Christians believed that the pagan gods were real and that they were powerful, that they really existed, but that they were devils. And now, in the 12th century, we see the devil rendered as a joke. And so this means, the symbolism is, he's not powerful, that he is laughable, his power is gone. Along with these new perceptions of Christ, Mary, and the devil, we see new conceptions of humans and women. And especially the elevation of women with the elevation of the Virgin Mary. And this goes along, again, with our picture here of King Arthur and the Round Table. It goes along with courtliness and with the idea of chivalry and the veneration of women in a very new way. The role that women take in the society of courtly love is a role of the ultimate example of the perfect human being who ennobles young knights by just glancing at them, and they fall madly in love with these women, and then will do anything in their service. Again, this is unrequited love. But as time goes on, the stories evolve, and so we end up having affairs among portrayed in some of the literature, and we also have in the literature of Chrétien de Troyes, we have the portrayal of the kind of married love that is the kind of love that is in our society today, where a young man and a young woman actually fall in love with each other and marry for love. And so we have all the portrayals of teenage love, of the cliches of pining away and sleepless nights and longing for the lover's presence, and so all of that is in this Arthurian literature and this rise of courtly love literature. And all of this is blossoming in the 12th century, and I'm reminding you of all of this again because what it all adds up to, there's also a humanistic movement of seeing the value of the world and human beings, because Christ was part of the world and became a human in the world. And so what we see here is an explosion of confidence, a confidence in this society that God loves them, that they can reach perfection they can reach the kind of perfection that Jesus does as God, that human beings can be perfect or at least strive for perfection, and that society is getting better and better in the progress to the road to the heavenly city. And it's this supreme confidence that we have to look at as the background to the explosion of Europeans across the world in the age of discovery breaking out all over, because these supremely confident people who feel that God is on their side and they are chosen by God then go out adventuring and virtually discover and practically conquer the whole world in only just a century. It's quite amazing. But it doesn't happen overnight. They have to develop this kind of confidence in themselves, this mentality that anything they do is right and God is on their side, before they can actually achieve such an accomplishment. And so we have to look at that. Here's a picture we have of women and the elevation of the status of women in this society as the creators or the exemplifiers of the perfect life, the perfection of women, the ennobling grace of women, I guess you would say, because they're reflections of the Virgin Mary, that they're sort of miniature reflections of the Virgin Mary. So here are some medieval women and their children, and it's in their role as mothers that they attain this nobility of spirit. It's also an age of great building all over Europe. I haven't shown you these buildings. These are some of my favorites. Remember last time I told you that the Gothic Cathedral, they invented all kinds of new engineering forms in order to build walls that have huge holes in them where they can put the windows, the stained glass windows, and have the heavenly light streaming in to fill the Church of God with God's holy light, and that the cathedral represents the entire universe, with the story of the entire universe from the creation to the last judgment and all the activities of human beings and all of history in between. Well, this little chapel is Saint-Chapelle, St. Louis Chapel in Paris. It's small, but it exemplifies all of those qualities that are the ideals of the Gothic Cathedral, soaring up to heaven, ever upward with its spires and its high ceilings, the walls pierced and practically diaphanous walls filled with stained glass. This is the exterior. Here is the interior, and you can see how those windows fill all the walls. And this one, I'm sorry I don't have it in color, but I told you also that the cathedrals were painted bright shades of red and blue and gold. And so you can see the ceiling there. It's painted a deep, rich blue with gold stars on it. And it's the vault of heaven. The vault of the cathedral is the vault of heaven. And that's what it symbolizes. So it's highly symbolic, and this is an exquisite little chapel that embodies the best of the Gothic cathedral. Here is the crypt. It's underneath that chapel that I just showed you, and with its soaring Gothic arches. The Gothic arches are pointed, and its slender columns. You can see there the columns are painted. Again, I'm sorry I don't have it in color, but the columns are all painted. The bright, vivid colors. Okay. So it's an age of great building, building everywhere, Gothic churches popping up in all the cities, and this is in the context of the growth of the cities. We looked at that in the year 1000. We looked at the urban revolution with the growth of cities everywhere. Here's a typical medieval city with the great cathedral in the middle of it, and the city built all around it with a round city wall around it in a circle. This is a typical medieval city, and the medieval cities rivaled each other. There was great competition as to who could build the highest and most glorious cathedral in the very center of the city. So this is what was going on in Europe. That was the prelude to the Age of Discovery. Okay, we also see the rebirth of logic and philosophy at the time, the rebirth of the flowering of art and music. Again, the introduction of reason into philosophy. Reason had been absent for a long time because people relied on just quoting St. Augustine or quoting the Bible. And with St. Anselm as one of the main introducers of reason, you have a new reliance on human reason. And we see the rise. These are musicians, or these are details of the musical congress. Musicians. These are actually kings together, and who are courtly jongleurs who sing and perform, along with the troubadours. Okay, these are Minnesingers in Germany. We also see the rise of universities, and we talked about the university as we know it being invented in the Middle Ages, the invention of the university. In general, it was the flowering of the Middle Ages, okay, so that we see society growing in Europe in all these different ways. Now, this was a preparation for the Age of Discovery. Now, when does the Age of Discovery start? Okay. When do you think the Age of Discovery starts? When would you guess it starts? When does your textbook say it starts? Who is the first discoverer? Columbus. Oh, that's what your book says. Okay, but your book says Columbus is the first discoverer, that he goes out and he discovers the New World, that there is a new world out there. I'm going to argue that he's not. Okay, who do you think I might say is the first discoverer?
Bartholomew Diaz.
Who?
Bartholomew Diaz.
Bartholomew Diaz. He would be a candidate for it, and he was a Portuguese explorer who then explored down the coast of Africa, so we might say he's a candidate for the first discoverer rather than Columbus. He discovered the whole coast of Africa and went all the way to India. Yeah, who would you say?
The Vikings, I think.
That's what I would argue. I would argue that the Vikings were the first to step out into, and I have some more that I'm going to say were precursors to Columbus as well. But the Vikings discovered the New World before Columbus did. We know that already, don't we? Because we've already looked at the Vikings. We'll come to the Vikings in a minute, but there were lots of people discovering each other. For example, for a long time, people had been connecting up with each other. If we look, for example, at Alexandria, Alexander's empire, he connected the Middle East with Persia and with India, so that we see the spread of all these cultures connecting together. Isn't this a kind of discovery of one culture of another, with Alexander's empire spreading out through this vast area of the Middle East, connecting Greece with the East and Egypt and all the way to India? How about the Roman Empire? The Roman Empire unified all the people around the Mediterranean Sea, pulling together the Far East and Europe, and even venturing out into the Atlantic. And so we have this expansion of the known world, at least around in the Middle East. And how about the Bay of Bengal? In the map of Asia, we have connections between India and Malaysia and China, with the spread of trade through the Bay of Bengal and with the spread of Buddhism into China and Japan and in all of Southeast Asia. So we see the connecting up of these cultures. And how about the Han Empire as a connector of a lot of cultures, moving from east to west and connecting the Middle East with China, and really creating the conditions which created the Silk Road connecting Europe and Asia. So we've got empires growing in both directions. Alexander growing eastward, and China growing westward to eventually meet each other. We might look at the expansion of Islam as connecting a lot of people together and being and what am I representing here? Something in the class that we've seen. This is something of a review of the whole class to prepare you for your final exam. What kinds of things are we seeing here? What am I showing you? You want me to go back? Okay, we've got the Han Empire. We've got the Bay of Bengal. That's not an empire, but we've got the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire. I'm showing you empires, and what does that call to your mind about what happens when there's an empire?
The culture is spread throughout that empire?
Yes, the culture is spread in a veneer over that whole empire. The culture spreads over the whole empire. It certainly does with Alexander. We have this Hellenistic culture spread as a uniform culture to this whole region. The same thing happens with the Roman Empire. A veneer of aristocratic culture spreads over the whole region. And what is so beneficial about this unification brought about by an empire? What is beneficial about it? What qualities does it have? Yeah.
Expansion of trade.
Yes, trade. And what do you need to have trade? You have to have, go ahead.
Resources.
Resources, you develop your resources, but what are the conditions that are necessary before you can develop your resources and have trade in a unified empire?
You need to have some kind of transportation system that works.
Sure, and all of these empires have road systems. They have sea routes that connect them together. How about peace? How about peace? Every single one of these empires is the center of, here we have the Pax Romana, and we don't, in this one, although we can look at China, the Pax Sinica, I called it, of the empire of the Chinese peace that created the conditions where people could trade peacefully and culture could spread. Warfare sometimes spreads culture too, but it does it violently, and trade doesn't happen in the midst of warfare. Trade happens in the midst of peace when you have a Pax Sinica or a Pax Romana or a Pax Islamica. Remember that you have peace in the Islamic Empire, so you can have these trade networks connecting everybody together so you can have a common culture spread in the whole region. And of course, Islam is, again, a veneer of culture that spreads over this Islamic empire and holds it together. It's the culture that holds it together. what have we got here? We've got the Mongolian Empire. Okay, now we have a Pax Mongolica, and we have the Mongol Empire again spreading culture throughout a vast region. This is probably the largest empire of any of them that we've encountered, larger than any of the European empires that would follow it. But this huge Pax Mongolica spreading and connecting the cultures. With the Pax Mongolica, you don't have a common culture because you have Chinese culture in the east and you have Muslim culture in the west of the Mongol Empire, and it doesn't last very long. But does any empire last very long? I mean, that's a question you might want to think about. But it does connect up the different cultures to each other and connect the trade routes so that trade can spread in both directions. Okay. Now, here is a map showing the trade routes in the Middle Ages. Okay, this is the time we're looking at when Europe starts to grow. Europe starts to grow as a very backward region, far behind the Islamic realms, far behind the Persian and the Mongolian and the Chinese culture. But then it zooms ahead. It zooms ahead. And how does it do that? Again, I tried to talk to you about the 12th century Renaissance before. Here are the trade routes, and part of it is just the connection with the eastern part of the country, with the Mongolian Empire, and the trade routes that allow Europe to grow and become very prosperous in a very fast way that's quite phenomenal. And this is often called the economic takeoff of Europe, that economists say should be the model for all third world countries. Europe started as a third world country, and then it had an economic takeoff, unlike anything we've seen before. Okay, so we have the trade routes connecting all of Asia to Europe. We might talk about, going back a little bit in time, the spread of Buddhism as a connector that connected all of the cultures of Asia together and gave them a common belief system. It's not the same everywhere in these Buddhist countries. Buddhism varies extensively according to the regions it's in. But Islam does the same thing, that it's not precisely uniform everywhere. But this is also a connecting of all these regions, the spread of Buddhism. We might also talk about Japan and the connecting of Japan. Even though Japan was very isolated as a maritime empire, a maritime culture, it was influenced by the mainland with its connections to China, and with the early migrations even before that of the Mongols and the Caucasians into Japan to create the Japanese culture. Okay, so all of these things, and then all of these things are connectors of different cultures. And then, as we were saying before, I would say the Vikings are the first ones to step outside of Europe and to start the age of discovery and start the age of exploration. And here are all the places that the Vikings went to. They went both to the east and to the west. They certainly hopped across those islands all the way across the Atlantic, the Orkneys, the Faroes, and Iceland that you can see on the map. The Faroes are right in the middle between those two, and then Iceland. So they use those islands as stepping stones. Greenland was a stepping stone, and they discovered the New World. They tried to colonize the New World, but they failed. They failed because their supply lines were too short. There were too few of them who went to North America, to the area that's called Vinland on that map. We know they went there. There are archaeological remains of the Viking settlements. There's at least one in Newfoundland. And there are accounts in the sagas, in the Vinland sagas, of people who went back again and again and again, because Leif Erikson had a set of houses there and he knew how to get there, and his sister and her husband with some other settlers went back to those houses that Leif had built, and they went back to them to live in them to try to settle in the New World. They brought their cows and their sheep and their animals with them, and they tried to settle. The reason they failed is simply because they were outnumbered by the Indians. There were just too few of them and too many Indians, American Indians, of course, and too few of them, and they were simply outnumbered, and they didn't have any technological superiority. I mean, they had a certain amount, but it wasn't enough to overcome the attacks of the Indians, and there were just too many of the Indians. So the Vikings were the first to really discover the New World. And here we can see the Scandinavian creations. The Vikings discovered Iceland, Greenland, and America in the 900s. They contributed to the settlement of Europe by creating new eastern kingdoms that then completed Europe. If you can think of Europe as its kind of core cultures as England, France, and Germany, now you see kingdoms coming together on the outskirts of Europe and attaching themselves and becoming part of the European culture. So this is the first expansion of Europe. We see the creation of these new kingdoms in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, which were swiftly converted to Christianity, relatively swiftly, at least the kings converted swiftly. The people took a lot longer, but they did become Christian kingdoms. And then Russia, which was first created as a if you want to call it a kingdom, by the Vikings, became converted to Eastern Orthodox religion through Constantinople, but it is a new European kingdom. And then Poland and Hungary also coalesced as kingdoms at this time. And so we see Europe expanding as we lead up to the age of discovery. We see the incorporation of the Slavs of Russia into the Byzantine culture and the assimilation of the Scandinavian and Slavic peoples into Europe. And so now we see the expansion of Europe as a prelude to the age of the discovery. And here is a map showing those new states in the north and the east that are now added to the core cultures of Europe in England, France, and Germany. Okay. And at this time, we see the beginning of the Crusades. With the Crusades, Europe takes its first steps outside its own culture. It's added those countries in the east, and now it starts expanding even further east. But first, this happens at the same time. But it begins, one of the things that happens during the Crusades is the pushing back of Islam out of Spain. And so Spain is reconquered by the Christian kingdoms in the north in a progression over a period between 1000 and 1300, a period of slow and steady progress, pushing the Muslims out of Spain. I'm sorry, I skipped a map. There should have been one in the middle there. But then we end up with just a little small remnant, Granada at the very bottom of Spain, and the formation of Portugal and Castile and Leon, and I'm forgetting the name of that other one that I can't read. Okay. But the kingdoms of Spain, Aragon and Barcelona are the other two kingdoms there. Until we see here with Castile and Leon blending together, incorporating Aragon. And so we see three major regions of Spain, Castile, and Leon as having the giant share of the Spanish Peninsula. And this is Columbus was an Italian, but he was sponsored by Queen Isabella of Spain and by the Kingdom of Castile and Leon. One of the things that we might notice about these states, if we look at the Vikings, we saw that they were a maritime culture. They faced the sea, they faced the the coastline and the challenge of the sea as their frontier. This is also true of Spain and Portugal, that they are on the edges of the sea facing out toward the Atlantic, and that's where the movement comes to go across the Atlantic with Columbus, just as the Vikings did. Meanwhile, the first movement, though, was the Crusades, and in 1037 the Seljuk Turks began to infiltrate into the Holy Land. They were nomads coming from Asia, sweeping into the Holy Land, conquering it, and they converted to Islam. And you know that new converts often are very much more dedicated to their religion than people who have been in that religion for a very long time. New converts tend to be more fanatical and more devoted. And so this was true of the Seljuk Turks. The response in Europe was, in 1096, the First Crusade. And again, Europeans turned outward and set their sights on the Holy Land to try to reconquer Jerusalem for Christianity. It's interesting that the first Crusaders, a lot of them were French, a lot of them were German. Not too many were German. Most of them were French. There was some English, and there were some Normans and Italians on the First Crusade. But the Muslims labeled them all Franks, and they by and large call themselves Franks as well. They came to call themselves Franks, and so the Franks were the ones who went on crusades. They had a very difficult time because warfare in France and to a certain extent in Germany and England had become much more formalized and ritualized, and so the kind of warfare that we saw in Europe tended to be more like surrounding and besieging a castle and starving it out. If they had battles, what they tried to do was to take people for ransom and sell their horse and their armor and hold them for ransom and get paid for it. So the Crusaders had a huge shock when they came across the Seljuk Turks, who actually killed them. And so they had to kill back. And so they were battle-hardened by the time they conquered Jerusalem in 1099. I think they were suffering from some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder by the time they went through the siege of Antioch in particular was particularly violent and gruesome, where they ate all their horses, and there were reports by the Muslims that they practiced cannibalism. They threw diseased bodies over the wall. It was really quite horrible. By the time they conquered Jerusalem, they were battle-hardened, and they were pretty immune to sparing human life. The city of Jerusalem, it was said that the streets ran ankle-deep with blood. They slaughtered everyone when they came to Jerusalem. They set up 4 kingdoms: the kingdom of Jerusalem and the counties of Edessa, Antioch, and Tripoli, and these were the Crusader states. They held onto those states for roughly 100 years. The states stayed in existence, and then the Muslims drove them out again. Islam recovered under the rise of new leaders. Nur al-Din, who I don't have in here, the best one who's known is Saladin, who is the great hero of the reconquest of the Holy Land. And under Saladin, whose main opponent was Richard Lionheart, and they were great. They were almost equals, equal heroes of both sides. But Saladin recovered Jerusalem and other parts, except for the seashore. They conquered most of the Holy Land. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade sacked and took Byzantium, fatally weakening it for another attack by the Turks later on. They founded the Latin kingdom in place on the Byzantine lands, and this too was very short-lived. If we want to say, were the Crusades to the Holy Land a success? We might say initially they were a great success. The Muslims were disunited and surprised. They were taken by surprise. The Franks initially conquered the states of the Holy Land. But if you look at them overall, they were a failure because the Muslims successfully drove them out. We can't say the same thing for the Northern Crusades. The Northern Crusades took place about 1125 to 1350, and a group of knights called the Teutonic Knights, who were a military order, like the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar were in the began in the First Crusade. The Teutonic Knights united to crusade against Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania in the north. These were pagan regions, and again, it's the expansion of Europe, expanding to the north, incorporating new territory. Here are some crusaders. This is actually St. Louis going on crusade. This is quite late in the Crusades. One of the important things about the Crusades is they learned to sail on the sea, they learned to make maps, they learned to navigate in the Mediterranean and go long distances and endure great hardship. So these are some of the steps toward the age of discovery, that they do learn all of these things, sailing in the Mediterranean. Here's a battle during one of the Crusades. This is the taking of Damietta in Egypt, which the Crusaders actually did on, I believe that was the, which crusade was that? It was the Fifth Crusade when they took Damietta. Okay, and so here are the Crusader states on the Holy Land. You see they're hugging the shore, and they don't have the main Islamic lands, like they don't have Damascus, they don't have Baghdad, but they have the shore of the Holy Land. They have Jerusalem, and they have Lebanon and Syria, and the area that's now Armenia. But they only have it for 100 years. You know, these states are gone in 100 years. 100 years is not very long to hold on to these places. And here are the routes they take across the Mediterranean, learning to sail the sea, improving their ships, improving trade, and binding the Mediterranean back together as a lake that unifies everything. Okay. In the process, what is this meant for? This is the this is the inclusion of the northern states, the Teutonic Knights going into the northern states. You can see next to Poland, to the west of Poland and north of Poland, those areas are the areas that were incorporated by the Teutonic Knights. Roughly there is that area that they conquered and they Christianized. There might be a little more than that there than I've circled. Okay, also we see the formulation of yet another great, I don't know if you want to call it a great empire, but certainly a unified state is Sicily and southern Italy, the kingdom of the two Sicilies. This is the other Norman conquest that most people don't know very much about. We all know that William the Conqueror conquered England from Normandy, and the Normans also conquered southern Italy and Sicily, and they were very active in the Crusades. Okay. Now, running up to the Crusades, some other things were happening in Europe. In the 1100s, Roger Bacon, an English scientist, speculated that there was land across the Atlantic. And Roger Bacon is a really spectacular guy. He wrote a huge amount of things. He was an alchemist and a scientist, and he was also a technologist. He dreamed about building wonderful machines like submarines and steam engines to run trains, and he foresaw trains and cars and airplanes and submarines. He also speculated that there was land across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the Scandinavians were still continuing to fish the banks of Newfoundland yearly until 1350. So every year fleets would go and they would harvest the rich cod off the coast of Newfoundland. They would cut down the trees and bring them to Greenland and Iceland, which had no trees. And they would harvest the timber and take it back. And so this trade was still going on across the North Atlantic until 1350. Why did it stop in 1350? Anybody know? What?
Is that when they started to come towards?
You want to press the...
Is that when the discovery started to come further south into like South America and that area? The focus became on that?
No, that was 1492. We've got 200 more years to go. 1350, something really important happened to the whole world, yeah.
100 Years' War?
No, well, it did happen in the 100 Years' War, but the 100 Years' War wouldn't affect Scandinavia, okay? Wouldn't affect Scandinavia. What happened in 1350? A great calamity. A great calamity. Anybody recall? You do?
The plague.
The plague. The Black Death hit Europe starting in 1347. By 1350, it had spread up to Scandinavia, and that's when the expedition stopped to Greenland. Well, actually, Iceland was also isolated for a while. The expedition stopped to Greenland, and the fishing expeditions and timber expeditions to the New World stopped in 1350. We'll come back to the Black Death in a few moments. Okay. Historians in Northern Europe knew about the New World. Everybody knew it was there, especially anybody who had any connections at all with the Scandinavians. Adam of Bremen was writing in the 12th century. He is the great chronicler of the Christianization of Scandinavia. He writes about it. He knew it was there. He describes the New World. In 1200, there were also theories that the world was round, and that it had climatic zones and equatorial zones and different climate zones ranging from the north to the equator. And in fact, there's a letter that Innocent III wrote that actually mentions Greenland by name. I'm going to show that to you in a moment. I'm going to show you that actual letter. Advances in ship technology took place as a result of the Crusades. They were building better ships and designing better ships. The ships got better and better. Now, the Vikings had absolutely wonderful ships to go across the North Atlantic, but interestingly, the Europeans didn't adopt those ships. The ships they adopted were more of a Mediterranean model, more of a Byzantine model of ship, and they made those better and better and better as the Crusades progressed. They rediscovered things that the Greeks had, like the astrolabe and the compass. They began drawing maps of the Mediterranean so that they could see where they were going and locate where they were going. Portoland charts are charts that show where the land and the sea is and where you can navigate. Quadrants also help you with your location, and so all of this technology they developed in the course of the Crusades, and quite early. In 1291, Guido and Ugolino Vivaldo, two Italians, set out across the Atlantic to find the Near East. Unfortunately, they never returned, so we don't know if they found America or not. But this is 1291, and they were already looking for it, okay? They knew something was there, and they were going out to find it. Well, let me show you a couple of these things. This is a map of the world according to Eratosthenes in 200 BC, okay? So this is 200 years before Christ, and this is all that the Greeks knew about, the Greeks and Romans knew about the world. This is everything they knew, a very small area, all the way to India because of Alexander, but they didn't know very much about it. It's not a very accurate map, except for the Mediterranean, which is very accurate if you look at that. Okay, here is the known world in 150 BC, sometime later. I'm sorry this is so blurry, it didn't blow up very well. But you can see that they know a little more about the world than they did in 200 BC because it's 50 years later. Here we see a map of the world by the astronomer and geographer Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD, so that's 400 years after the first one. Now they know a whole lot about the world. You see how they've connected up with northern Africa, and now they know a whole lot about Asia, and that's a pretty accurate map of Europe, isn't it? So they're learning about the world and to locate everything. But notice in the north, unexplored lands, and Silk Land they call the Mongolian area Silk Land, and China is pretty much off their map. And in the south, everything is unexplored lands. Okay, let's jump ahead 600 years to 800 AD, the time of the Vikings, just before the Vikings go across the Atlantic. And now we know more about China, India, Persia. Very accurate knowledge of Europe and North Africa, and now they know about Scandinavia, okay, because that's on the map. This would have been, they could have referred to Tacitus, a Roman writer who described Scandinavia. And now we see the known world in 1000 AD, and we're adding on the discoveries across the Atlantic that the Vikings had found. Now, I told you they were getting better, and these last maps I've shown you are not maps that were actually drawn at the time, but here is a map that actually was drawn at the time. This is the Hereford map, and it was drawn in the 12th century. It kind of shows Jerusalem as the center of the world. It's a little bit hard to locate places, but it's a map. You know, they're learning how to draw maps, and they're getting better and better at doing it. Here's a blow-up of that map. You can see a little bit more of it. Obviously, the Mediterranean Sea is in the center, and Jerusalem is the center of that. But I don't think it's that accurate. But the places on it is interesting to read the places on it. Here is a map of the known world about 1300, and now you see this is well before Columbus. Columbus was 1492. Okay, this is 1300, and we have all those Viking places where they're fishing and they're getting timber. And now we know a lot about the coast of North Africa and Arabia and practically in the whole Mongol Empire. They know all about those regions. They know all about Scandinavia. So they're learning more about the world. This is this letter of Innocent III that mentions Greenland, and I've got Greenland highlighted in yellow there. I'm going to blow that up so you can see. This is a letter in Latin because everything was written in Latin. Can you read that? Can you read that? It says Greenland. So he knows that Greenland is there. Innocent III was Pope in 1200, roughly 1200. That's the center of the time when he was Pope. Okay. Now, ships. This is a Spanish Armada. Okay. Ships were getting better and better, and we see ship technology improving drastically. Here is a caravel of the 15th century. This little ship is the kind of ship that Columbus took when he sailed across the New World. Okay, here is a full-rig ship that then became the ship that routinely crossed the Atlantic. Okay, and here is again an example of the technology that they were rediscovering. The compass was actually invented by the Greeks, and it was used by the Muslim world, and the Europeans rediscovered the compass and took it as part of their navigational repertoire of what they could do. Okay, now, again, the Europeans are reaching out outside of Europe well before Columbus in 1254, and we've already looked at this, we've talked about it, or we're just doing it in a different context here. In 1254, the Pope of Rome sends missionaries to the courts of the Mongol rulers of China. These are William of Rubric and John of Montecorvino, and you have readings for tonight by these two as they describe their journeys into the Mongol Empire. In 1256, just 2 years later, Marco Polo began his 20-year journey to the court of Kublai Khan, and he went to East and Southeast Asia. He went overland on the Silk Road to go across the mountains and the deserts to get to the fabled courts of Kublai Khan in China. He came back along the coastline. We'll see a map in a moment, but he went around China and around Malaysia and through the Bay of Bengal and through India and up the coast of Arabia through the Red Sea. When he got back, there was a war going on between Venice and Genoa, and he was accused, I think it was in Genoa, he was accused of being a spy, and so they threw him in prison. Lucky for us, because he had nothing else to do, so he wrote about all his travels and described them all for us. It became the bestseller of the 13th century. Everybody was just avid to see what was out there, what was outside of Europe, and where were all the places that you could go and adventure and learn about new people. Again, this incredible optimism and confidence that the Europeans had. They didn't have any fear, you know. They were ready to go out there and find what there was. In Europe, there was a lot of contact with the Mongols and the East, and here I've given you two examples of it that whetted the appetite for travel and discovery. And there were two other mythical characters that the books were written about, stories were written about. Prester John was said to have founded a Christian kingdom. Whether it was in Asia or Africa, nobody knew. I mean, it's a legendary kingdom. But the legend was that he had founded a Christian kingdom and people were going to try to find it. The Travels of John Mandeville told fantastic, wild stories about the wild things he might see as he traveled around. This is also mythical. It's mythical in that the things he described can't possibly be true, and they were actually descriptions that go all the way back to Roman mythology and Greek mythology about the strange peoples in the outside world. So they're legendary. They're made up. Here is Marco Polo, a picture of Marco Polo, the great Italian adventurer. And here is his route. Those purple lines, we saw these before. The purple lines are the missionaries who go from Rome to the capital, Karakoram, of the Mongol Empire there. And the yellow lines are the route of Marco Polo. You see he goes across the Silk Route, across the deserts and the mountains to China, Cathay, and then he comes back along the coastline. You can see him coming along the coast, and his travels describe everything he saw along the way. The Chinese also, under the Mongol empires at first, they were also exploring, and we can look at this route that Marco takes along the sea. This is a route that the Admiral Chen Ho also took with his Chinese junks to go all the way to Arabia and Africa. But remember that when he came back to China, and this was a couple of hundred years after Marco Polo, the Song Empire, once they had thrown the Mongols out, China turned inward upon itself and was not interested in the world outside. And never again, until modern times, did the Chinese go out to explore the world like Admiral Chen Ho had done with his Chinese junks. Okay, now what happened was the Black Death. The Black Death hit Europe in 1347 to 1350. It may have been facilitated by the Mongol Empire and the crusading trade networks. Certainly we know that it spread along the Silk Road, coming along the Silk Road, and struck Byzantium first, and then Italy in 1347. And I've mentioned this to you before. The old theory used to be that it was spread by black rats on ships who carried a particular kind of flea, who had a particular kind of bacteria, which was injected into people that they bit. More modern studies of the Black Death are questioning whether that's completely true, and there may have been a combination of several different diseases that were being spread. one of the diseases of the plague takes a different form. It can be spread through bacteria. It can be spread through sneezing and coughing, an airborne plague, and that may be a different kind of plague. But when it hit Europe, nobody knew what to do. They were completely dumbfounded. They had never seen anything like this. People were dropping like flies all around. And with the airborne plague, people could die within 4 hours of catching it. They would just drop dead. 1/3 to 1/2 the population of Europe died, more in the cities, and they didn't know what to do about it. They didn't know how to cure it. So they stuffed herbs in their pockets to try to ward it off. They put garlic around their necks. They tried everything. They sang songs. They went to church and they prayed, and nothing stopped the plague. Are you all familiar with that song, that little song we teach our children? Ring around the rosy, pocket full of posy. Well, those are the herbs you use to ward off the Black Death. That's why you put the posies in your pocket. Ashes, ashes, that means achoo, achoo. All fall down, everybody dies. So you might not want to teach your children that little nursery rhyme. Anyway, that's a song of the Black Death. That's a song of the Black Death. And every medieval institution was affected. Europe was utterly transformed. Economically, all trade came to a dead halt. Nobody was farming on the farms anymore. Nobody cared. If there was any food being grown, nobody took it to market. In the cities, half the people died, and so entrepreneurs would go out and grab their property. Sometimes whole families would die, and so their property was just up for grabs, and lots of people who were opportunists would grab everything. The good churchmen died because they took care of the sick and the dead, and they buried the dead. The dead were piling up in the streets, by the way, faster than they could cart them away. And there are chronicles that describe this, where they describe it blow by blow, every aspect of the plague. It was absolutely horrible. The whole world was turned upside down. People lost faith in the church, and so this is part of the reason of the Protestant Reformation, that the good people in the church died, and people who were gold diggers and opportunists took the church prebends and also illiterate because they hadn't been trained to read and write. And so you have incompetent people running the church, opportunists of all kind, so that the church was overlooked. There was a labor shortage, okay? So many of the farm workers died and the urban workers in the city that there was a labor shortage, and that meant their labor was in demand and they could ask for more money. And so when they did that, when they asked to be paid more, this meant the status of the peasants rose because they were more in demand and they could demand more rights and privileges and money. And so the government retaliated by slapping wage and price controls on everything to try to control them. This is what happened in England, that they tried to control them. And the peasants didn't like that, and so there were peasant revolts all over Europe. The peasants rebelled. There was social unrest and uproar, and all of Europe was completely affected. And so everything was in such an uproar that the expansion of Europe stopped for almost a century. And so they sort of, they had to deal with this. They had to do something about it. So they stopped expanding. And to make things worse, the Ottoman Turks, a new wave of Turks, arrived in the Holy Land, and Europe was so weakened that the Ottoman Turks conquered Byzantium, and then they pushed their way as far as Austria into Europe. And so we have a reversal of this expansion that's going on. And here we see the trade routes again in Asia, that the plague came down through the Silk Road from China. We don't know where it originated. We don't even know what it was. Here are the peasants' revolts when they didn't get the rights they demanded, and they knew economically they could demand those rights, and they were vicious revolts. I mean, They did terrible things. They slaughtered the nobles and the aristocrats. There's a terrible story of the peasants slaughtering a noble family and cooking the husband and making the wife eat him. Just terrible stories of the atrocities. And then the nobles responded with equal atrocities against the peasants. I mean, they were not innocent. And so you can see the farmers fighting with pitchforks here. And so this is what happened. And here are the Ottoman Turks conquering Asia Minor. It's the white part there that is the Ottoman Empire. And they pushed their way all the way as far as Vienna, on the borders of Hungary, as you can see. This is why Bosnia is Muslim today. Parts of Bosnia and Bulgaria and Macedonia, there are Muslim enclaves in those areas because the Ottoman Turks moved into that area and stayed there several centuries. Okay, so these are the Ottoman Turks. Now, it was at this point, and I'm going to go back to that, it was at this point that Europe, after a time of rest and recovery, began and took up the expansion once again. And when they did it, the leaders were from the Spanish Peninsula. And I think we'll take our break right here, and when we come back, we will look at the details of what our book calls the Age of Discovery. I've been arguing that it started a long time before 1492 and Columbus, and I'm going to now argue that the Age of Discovery starts in 1415 with Prince Henry the Navigator, and we'll take up that story when we come back from our break.